and good evening all. Thank you for joining us for what is remarkably guide number 77. Lucky number 77 perhaps, knock on wood. And tonight we're back in the modern age at the other end of the Lola story to take a look at the last of the Lola prototypes, the B08 series. This was originally supposed to be a short video so that I had some extra time for wedding planning and such this week, and instead it's another near hour-long deep dive. And while I agree that this video and the Daytona prototype deep dive video and any other such long-form content really deserves to have original race footage included for context and visual enjoyment, the copyright thumbscrews are kept pretty tightly down by both IMSA and WEC these days, so unfortunately it's just going to be mostly Assetto Corsa footage and my photos where relevant and available. So apologies, but hope you enjoy anyway. So let's get started. After a rather underwhelming mid-90s following the collapse of IMSA GTP and Group C, Lola cars started to get back on the up and up with a series of fairly successful open-topped Le Mans prototypes in the late 90s and early 2000s, including the MG EX257 that we covered back in Underdog Week. Changes to the homologation regulations started to encourage, and eventually require, manufacturers to shift to closed cockpit prototypes, and Lola did so with the announcement of the B08 in 2006, with more than 200 hours of wind tunnel testing commencing in early 2007, at first on scale models to refine aerodynamics and styling features, with the initial design finalized by December of that year. Originally planned just as an LMP1 car, an LMP2 variant was approved during the B08/60s development, deemed the B08/80. I had very briefly managed to figure out their naming schema when researching the EX257 and the Aston Martin DBR1-2, or maybe back when I was doing the T92/10 video, which does need a re-record, as both the MG and Aston had internal Lola designations following a similarly idiosyncratic naming scheme, but I've since forgotten it. So today's rationale is that the /60s were LMP1s and the /80s were LMP2s because they stole some naming strategies from George Lucas, who was going to use them as astromech droid designations when he was coming up with world-building aspects for Star Wars during the 70s, and the 30-year limit on idea stealing that's definitely enshrined in international law finally expired in 2006. You can check on that. It's in the Geneva Convention on Intellectual Property Theft that I totally didn't just make up. Actually, post-edit Lensler here with some serious clarification once I went back through old notes. Generally speaking, the modern Lola models follow a slightly odd way of tracking their model numbers, but it does have a logic to it nonetheless. The first number for each model specifies the nominal year of production for the design, such as 08 being a car that was designed for production and launch in 2008. The /XX number is a bit like a golf score, with performance level inversely proportional to the numeric value in the tens place. In contrast, the digit in the ones place typically referred to a different power plant variant of the otherwise same model. That doesn't explain why they jumped from B06/10 as their last LMP1 before the B08/60 when they were both intended as LMP1s, but be that as it may. In addition to the B08/60 and /80, we also had a B08/90, which was a nominal LMP3 and track day car, and the B08/70, which we briefly mentioned during our Daytona prototype deep dive, and which was obviously unrelated in architecture to the /60 or /80. I just wanted to clear that up for all of those among you who I'm sure were sharpening your keyboards to inflict righteous dullness in the comments. The B08/80 was an offshoot of the original design by Julian Soule and Phil Tiller, optimized for the LMP2 regulations and racing conditions, namely privateer teams, lower top speeds, and generally lower power and budget outputs, certainly as the hybrid era came into play. They jointly represent the first closed cockpit design for the marque since the wonderful flash in a pan that was the T92, and proved to have substantially greater staying power in the series, although that wasn't really the T92's fault, as Group C was falling apart at the seams at the time. Both the P1 and P2s were built around a common architecture with an FIA-approved carbon composite monocoque and integrated survival cell in many ways derived from the preceding open cockpit B06 series, and featuring similar cooling solutions for the engine, while also carrying over those larger and, in my opinion, uglier nose and toe box designs from the B07s. The /60 cars were more robustly built than the /80s, in keeping with the differing exigencies of LMP1 and LMP2 competition, with the only significant mechanical differences lying in a lighter weight, slightly shorter dimensions, and different suspension geometry for the LMP2. Nevertheless, both sported the typical double wishbone and pushrod suspension, a Lola 6-speed sequential manual, with one major exception that we'll touch upon in a moment, and then as the years went by, things got a little bit more mixy, and Michelin tires. Given that the coupe design had substantial differences in aerodynamics and ergonomics from the open-top cars that Lola had been building for the past decade and a half, these new vehicles were also fitted with air conditioning systems to comply with rules regarding driver comfort, and significant attention was paid to ensuring that driver changes were as seamless as possible, and that the windshield and wipers minimally interfered with airflow. Brake calipers were, generally speaking, from AP, with carbon rotors of various sourcing depending on the team. Units from Hitco were spec, and some teams alternately did opt for Brembo platters. Stock weight for the P1 was 900 kilos, obviously with some variability depending on the power plant chosen, while the P2 averaged about 75 kilos lighter. So that's, 1,800 pounds and 1,650 pounds or so? Backpacking off some of the remarks of the T70 video and continuing a long-running Lola tradition, actually, opportune referential humor here, the name for which Lola Cars originally took its name was not the rather annoying tune by the Kinks, but rather from a song lifted from the musical Damn Yankees, titled Whatever Lola Wants, with Lola Gets occasionally appended to complete the song's verse in title. But in this instance, it was more of whatever Lola customers want, Lola Gets, as the B08 series was also designed to take numerous power plants, with differing manufacturers offering power plants for P1 and P2 competition. We'll go year by year through the developments for each car, including the power plants and teams operating them, as well as a pretty exhaustive history of their competition results in those seasons. Kicking off in 2008 with the global economy in freefall, the fine folks over at Aston Martin decided that it was time to really get in the spirit of things and burn some cash with a prototype program following their considerable success with ProDrive and the DBR9. And they purchased the first B08/60 chassis for their effort. Perhaps unsurprisingly, perhaps kismet for the ill-fated Le Mans program 40-ish years prior, this purchase also immediately created a problem. The 6-liter Aston Martin V12 didn't actually fit in the chassis. Thus, we arrive at our aforementioned exception. The Lola gearbox was dispensed with and replaced with a more compact X-Track unit so that the car would actually, fit the stuff it was supposed to be fitting inside. That particular deviation has been covered somewhat more extensively in the Aston Martin DBR1-2 video, also known as the B09/60, but as a reminder, Aston wanted to use their 6-liter V12 from the DBR9 GT1 car because they, A, had experience with the engine, B, thus knew it was reliable, and C, would derive additional benefit from rules that provided additional power to production-based engines, which the 12-cylinder was-ish. Aston, Lola, and ProDrive, who were responsible for building the cars, and after Lola did the tub, partnered with the Czech Republic-based Charus, I'm probably mispronouncing that, racing squad to campaign the car in the 08 Le Mans series and at Le Mans itself, with Tomáš Enge as their headline driver. This was the only new car in LMP1 in the LMS, though Chamberlain Motorsport started the season with a B06 before retiring after only one race. Charus's year was actually rather a good one, all things considered. Although unable to match the mighty Audi and Peugeot diesels on pace, unsurprisingly, the proven power plant and team's experience meant that they stayed in the running and finished every race, no mean feat, and managed a podium on the car's debut at the season opener in Catalonia, and a commendable second place behind the number 1 Audi R10 to finish the season at Silverstone. besting all the other petrol-powered teams to win a proverbial best of the rest for Aston and Lola. Their closest competition came from a Pescarolo 01, but as they had 2 retirements in the 5-round season, they were never really in it to challenge outright, and only achieved a better result than the Lola Aston at the Spa round. In LMP2 for the Le Mans series, the honor fell to the Swiss speedy racing team SIBA, which I've never actually said out loud before, and that is a heck of a name. The team name was Speedy Racing Team SIBA. They were from Switzerland. To campaign the first chassis, powered by a Judd 3.4-liter V8, and they too were alone with the new car until Ray Malek's team acquired the third /80 chassis, more on the second one in a moment, completed it with spares from their open-topped AER-powered MG Lola car, and took it racing in the last outing of the season. Unlike in LMP1, the competition was more hotly contested, rather than being a TDI-HDI walkaway, and the Lolas struggled a bit in their first season, with the MG team the best placed of any runners of a Lola chassis, although most of this was completed with the older open-topped car. Speedy Racing did manage a second place at Catalunya, but went unclassified or not classified at Spa, and retired at Silverstone, leaving Malek and the Quiffel? I think they're from Portugal, so ASM team ahead of them, both running older Lolas, and the top 3 steps of the championship podium, all occupied by privateer Porsche RS Spyders. Le Mans saw a mixed bag of Lola chassis entered, mostly older chassis, with only Speedy Racing and Charouz in possession of the coupes at the time, but the Aston power plant managed to outqualify one of the Audis to grid 6th overall, while the other petrol-powered LMP1s were lagging behind a bit, and the LMP2 car qualified about mid-pack in what was admittedly a very competitive field. Again, though, the wheels of fate turned against the cars, particularly the P1, and a relatively early collision that necessitated extensive repairs dropped them from contention. While they did manage to finish the race, it was at the back of the LMP1 pack, 13 laps in arrears from the Audi that it had outqualified. Or perhaps that should be Audi qualified. Nah. The Speedy P2, on the other hand, failed to finish out after 194 laps. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the American Le Mans Series, or ALMS, there wasn't much action for the new car. The first chassis delivered on the friendly side of the sea went to BK Motorsports to replace their B/07 LMP2 and debuted at the 10th round in the 11-event season at Petit Le Mans. Powered by a turbocharged Mazda 2-liter straight 4 carried over from the previous car, they were up against a veritable phalanx of Porsche RS Spyders and Acura ARX-01Bs, and as such they were again a bit outclassed. Penske effectively ran the field that year with their RS Spyder Evo, battling with Petron Highcroft, Dyson, and Andretti much more so than BK, who missed several races that season. To be fair, the Penske car even won Sebring outright that year, so it's not as though the others were really in with much of a shout. In the interseason, the B08 was improved into the B09, with the B09/60 actually being a designation given to 2 cars. One, a special collaboration with Aston that ran with custom bodywork. More details in that video on the channel, but we're going to talk about it more in a few moments anyway. And the only other appearance of a markedly improved LMP2 chassis was the XDK chassis, sold on to Dyson Racing for their continued efforts in the ALMS, who had swapped away from their RS Spyders for the Lolas, which sported some minor bodywork improvements for airflow management that nominally improved stability and tire life. Continuing in the ALMS theme, the Lola LMP1s remained older open-topped cars, and the LMP2 field was substantially diminished, with Dyson's only competition coming from Fernandez Racing's Acura, and it was indeed Acura's year. Both of the Dyson cars were DNF at Sebring, and generally outstripped by the Japanese machine, but Butch Leitzinger and Marino Franchitti managed 2 wins for the team and car, the first at Lime Rock Park that year, and the second at a sodden and foreshortened Petit Le Mans. Although the second of those results came with a bit of an asterisk after the other Dyson car, driven by Chris Dyson and Guy Smith, was not classified despite leading the class when the race was cancelled. Nevertheless, the winning car struggled back from early gear selector issues and thus the back of the pack to a bit of a silver lining win for the team. Drayson Racing had joined the LMP1 field for Petit Le Mans with a non-Aston powered B09/60, instead relying on a Judd V10, but they were well down the racing order and also went unclassified, with the season closer at Monterey seeing a mere 2 laps completed for the team. Hardly a fine beginning for their Le Mans ambitions. In the, I'm calling it ELMS, just the Le Mans series, wasn't called the ELMS at the time, but just saying LMS feels kind of awkward and I'll probably slip up at some point, so I'm making a conscious choice in the scripting process to willfully make that small error for the sake of clarity. The new Aston Martins, now looking as fast as they were supposed to go, had a seasons of highs and lows. The 007 car, appropriately, was never off the podium for the 5-round season, well ahead of the 009 car and Speedy Racing's new LMP1 entry that they'd purchased from Aston once they had their hands on their shiny new toys. So it was a B08/60 Aston Lola. The latter's best result was second at the season finale at Silverstone, ahead of Mr. Bond, and just behind a Team Orica 01, driven by Olivier Panis and Nicolas Lapierre. There were no less than 4 LMP2 B08s that season, however, and they rather bookended the points table, with Ray Malek's team pretty much struggling after the loss of their MG engines with 3 retirements, a 7th, and a 2nd place that was wholly negated with a 14-point penalty at the end of the season to put them right at nil points. Racing Box ran 2 cars with moderate success only to miss the Silverstone round, coming 3rd and 4th in the championship as a result, and our old friends over at Speedy had to content themselves with 2nd place overall after Quifel. I really don't know how to pronounce that, and if I say it too wrong, it's just going to sound bad. Quiffle had 2 wins and a 2nd place to win the season. Though Speedy did take victory at Silverstone, the Quiffle team were just quicker in much the same way that the Acura was over in the ALMS. At Le Mans, it was the Aston Lola collabs that were, again, best of the rest in qualifying, although this time not managing to outstrip any of the great factory diesels, followed closely by their year-old car from Speedy. At the same time, they were well ahead of the 2 privately entered Collis Audi R10 TDIs, so I suppose that's something. Interestingly, one of the Collis R10 TDIs, there was the son of the chap who bankrolled the entire T92/10 effort, which is a fun little mini fact. But anyway, in LMP2, the Porsches remained quite dominant, with the fastest duo of RS Spiders more than 3 seconds quicker than the Speedy Racing Lola LMP2 in qualifying, an advantage that one might call difficult, bordering on insurmountable for any hopes of class victory that year. And during the race, yet again, it was the 007 car of Jan Charuz, Tomasz Anga, and Stefan Mürke that outlasted many of the faster diesels and outpaced the other petrol cars to miss out on an outright and class podium by only a couple of laps. But the other 2 LMP1 Lola chassised cars finished below the fastest of the Lola LMP2s, who themselves only made it to the 2nd step of the podium, behind the Team Essex RS Spider that qualified on pole. The fastest of the Lola LMP2s nearly only managed 3rd, promoted by a last-hour crash-out from the leading Navi Team Go Porsche, and finishing 2 laps ahead of the aforementioned LMP1s and 12th overall. 2009 is, of course, also notable for Peugeot's outright victory in LMP1, the first time since 1999 that a non-Audi, or honestly, Gov, it's a Bentley, look, it's green, had won victory at Les Sarthe. But that's a story for, when we hit 10,000 subscribers, probably. So, if you want to get a sarcastic history of the diesel spaceships with some pointless wordplay and obscure references, go forth and proselytize the sardonic word to your friends. Okay, 2010, new decade, new me, or something. 2010 saw the B10/60, see the logic now, introduced, with no new LMP2 model, so those folks kept running or upgraded to the B09/80. The B10/60 did not have a separate Aston Martin companion model this time, with Aston Martin Racing content to continue with the 09 for a second year, although they sold the number 008 car to the team that is now Signatech Alpine, then called Signature Plus, and it was the Frenchies, actually, who campaigned the only full not ELMS season for the car. The B10 saw additional airflow refinements focused on the front splitter and diffuser, and a few new engines made their debut. In LMP1, this, well, I was about to say came in the form of a 5.5-liter Judd V10 in both of the Debutante Rebellion racing entries, but technically there had been a Judd V10 running at Petit Le Mans the year previous, so it's not technically new, but it was the first time it had been seen in competition on the European side of the Atlantic. This was also what powered Drayson Racing's efforts across the ELMS, ALMS, and Le Mans itself. In LMP2, Honda Acura power plants made their debut with Ray Malek's team after their disastrous last season with a Mazda, using the same 3.4-liter V8 that was powering the ARX-01C, but the model designation remained otherwise unchanged. We'll start with the ALMS, as that was the first season to kick off with a test at Sebring in late February, followed by the 12 Hours of Sebring in March. One must, of course, bear in mind that at the time, the American and international racing seasons were at relative loggerheads, and the arguable traditional season opener, the 24 Hours of Daytona, at least it was in the 70s and 80s, was under the thumb of NASCAR and thus part of the Grand Am series at the time, with the Daytona prototypes serving as their top class and not competing elsewhere. In the 2010 running of the ALMS, we had some noteworthy rule changes, most significantly the combining of LMP1 and LMP2 into a unified Le Mans prototype class for most of the season, excepting Sebring and Petit Le Mans, with LMP2 supplanted on the grid by Le Mans Prototype Challenge and the Oreca FLM09, with the big European factory squads participating as they felt a need or desire. Thus, Sebring, for the purposes of the ALMS, was won by Muscle Milk's LMP2 Porsche RS Spider ahead of the Drayson Racing B09, 29 laps in arrears. But it was in actuality won by Peugeot, going 1-2 in a pretty convincing walkover ahead of the good old 007 chassis in third, 3 laps behind. Dyson picked up vital points for the season championship in the race, but was well down the order overall. Absences and DNFs haunted both Drayson and Dyson throughout the season, and both fell well short of the Patron Acura and Muscle Milk Porsche in the championship, although each Lola team did pick up a win in the mid-season, at Road America and Mid-Ohio respectively. Peugeot then came back to dominate Petit Le Mans for the second year in a row, with the best placed of the Lolas and older B06 that finished 5th, behind the leading LMP2 and 11 laps down from the 908. Which, I mean, really, when you think about it, the power dynamics in the sport in the late 2000s and early 2010s are hardly what you can call fair. Audi was dropping, a couple $100 million a year on their combined LMP1 efforts, and were expecting teams led by a Labour MP and a chap who's less well-known than a vacuum salesman of the same name to keep up? It's patent madness, my dear people. Nevertheless, over in Europe, and the not ELMS, it was again the Peugeot teams that reigned supreme, although not hugely dominant. Team Oreca and the Peugeot factory squads each took home a single win at Algarve and Silverstone respectively. Audi won the season opener at Paul Ricard, and a Ginetta, of all things, won at the Hungaroring. But the Signature Plus, Lola, Aston, and Rebellion cars put in consistent performances to both earn podiums at Algarve and the Hungaroring, admittedly against diminished fields, to place second and third in the championship respectively. Meanwhile, the other Rebellion Lola took home third at Paul Ricard, behind the 009 Lola Aston, and generally speaking, a lack of consistent entries denied any other teams a chance at the championship, with 3 of the 4 full-season entries, Peugeot, Signature, and the number 12 Rebellion, filling that year's championship podium, and the number 7 Audi's 2 podiums to start the season, keeping the other Rebellion from making it within spitting distance by a single point. Incidentally, Charus was over at Oak Racing and running a Pescarolo at this point, just for the record. However, in LMP2, Mr. Malik's new power plant came good, and they put in a strong season capped with a victory at Algarve to hold off a challenge from what was arguably a more competitive car in the form of the Straka ARX-01C. The Straka car won every race it completed, but retirements at Spa and Algarve, where the Team RML Lola Honda finished second and first respectively, meant that Slow and Steady did indeed win the race, or better still, the championship. However, none of the other Lola entries in LMP2 did particularly well, again from a combination of inconsistent entries and poor finishes, and this is all getting a bit depressing for the Lolas. At Le Mans that year, the story was much the same as the year prior for the Lola chassis entries. It was Diesel über alles im der Track, although probably that should be to the tune of Le Marseille, as Peugeot was 1, 2, 3, 4 in qualifying, with the fastest 908 more than 2 seconds ahead of the fastest R15, and the 007 Aston again the fastest of the petrol-engined cars, 8th overall, but 7 seconds behind the top qualifier. They did qualify in 3 out of the 4 top slots for non-diesels, but only one other Lola, that of Drayson, qualified ahead of that Straka ARX, with both Rebellion cars behind by half a second and 4 seconds respectively, mixing it up with the rest of the LMP2s. The race itself was one that most of the Lola running teams would probably prefer to forget. While again, never in the running for the overall victory, the lucky 007 car this year couldn't even finish ahead of the best of the LMP2s, with the Straka ARX-01C besting them by 2 laps, still 30 laps behind the record-setting and still holding R15 of Mike Rockenfeller, Timo Bernhard, and Romain Dumas, and the best finish for a Lola chassis in any class was, again, RML in LMP2, with Mike Newton, Thomas Erdos. Is there an Erdos number for racing? And Andy Wallace taking third in class behind Straka and Oak. They were the only one of the Coupe Lolas to finish, actually, and the only other Lola-built car to earn classification was the KSM B07, 106 laps behind the victors. Both Rebellion cars, to be fair, on their first outing at Les Arts, failed around midway, one out due to an accident at lap 143 and the other with gearbox failure at lap 175. Oh, this was also the inaugural and penultimate year of the Intercontinental Le Mans Cup, a sort of amalgam of the ALMS and ELMS with an extra race in China thrown in, because we didn't have enough feeder series for the 24-hour race. But it was, again, only 3 races. It was Petit Le Mans, I think a Silverstone round, and one at Zhuhai or something, I don't know, somewhere in China. And there was minimal participation from Lola running teams. Drayson contested the first... Oh, look, I've written it down here. Drayson contested the first 2 rounds at Silverstone and rode Atlanta without much success against Audi and Peugeot, and MIK Corsa Racing Box just ran 2 cars at Silverstone, again without much in the way of success. Moving into 2011, we received updates to both the P1 and P2 versions of the B08 series, dubbed, you guessed it, the B11/60 and B11/80. A substantial modification to the carbon fiber bodywork was undertaken to comply with new regulations from the ACO, some of which were, in typical French fashion, allegedly to respect the environment, as if motorsports was ever going to provide a net benefit to Johnny Polar Bear, and to improve safety after some issues with aerodynamic lift and windage became evident in previous years. P2 variants of the car thus received a mandatory dorsal fin for improved high-speed stability. The P1s featured improvements to the front suspension and front bodywork, the latter designed by Julian Soule in the Lola wind tunnel and bringing with it wider front tires, new headlamps, a, in my opinion, prettier nose, and improvements to brake cooling, while the P2 received largely similar attention that also emphasized lower drag. With the inimitable RS Spiders now out of homologation and Porsche's focus shifting to an LMP1 program, it was announced in July of that year, the Lolas pretty much had the field to themselves that year in the ALMS, with Level 5 Motorsports having LMP2 completely to themselves, while in LMP1, Dyson and Oryx Racing were campaigning B09s with Mazda engines. There was one B06 still hanging around with an AER power plant, and Muscle Milk Racing got a hold of one of the Lola Astons and gave it an excellent-looking white and black livery to compete in the States. It's almost enough to put you in the mood for a premixed protein drink. Emphasis on the almost. Dyson, however, proved the class of the ALMS field that year, with championship wins at Sebring and Petit Le Mans to open and close the season. Although this, of course, again belies the actual state of affairs in which the Dyson car finished behind a Peugeot, an Acura, another Peugeot, and 2 Audis. They did, however, beat Rebellion's entry and one of the Peugeots and got the championship points. Level 5 did win LMP2 outright in class, although as their 2 entries made up half of the entire field, that's perhaps less surprising. The rest of the season was largely battled out between Dyson and Muscle Milk, with Muscle Milk's Aston dominating the middle part of the season to take wins at Long Beach, Mosport, Mid-Ohio, Road America, and then there was a factory Aston that showed up to win Laguna Seca for some reason, and probably actually robbed Muscle Milk of the championship. Dyson's performance at the season bookends proved sufficient points to win the championship, however, and Level 5 managed to end up competing with themselves as they swapped to an Acura for the last 2 races of the season. In the Not LMS 2, participation with Lola chassis was down. Rebellion was the sole defender of the Mark's honor in LMP1, and LMP2 saw 2 open-topped cars running, one an older MG Lola, although it can really hardly be called that as it was now powered by a Judd BMW 3.6-liter V8, and PCOM Racing entering a new open-topped budget car that Lola had developed, the B11/40, similarly powered. Neither of these cars made much odds, and apart from a second place at the season opener at Paul Ricard for PCOM, the cars struggled to complete more than half of the races they entered, and when they did manage to finish, they stayed essentially mid-pack, with Greaves Motorsports' Zytek Nissan running away with the championship ahead of Straka's good old Acura. Rebellion, however, saw a more competitive season. Though never outright victory, they did manage 2 podiums at the season bookends behind the Pescarolo squad, but slightly outperformed the Frenchies in the mid-season to win the championship by a single point. Although again, they were the only 2 teams contesting the whole season, so someone had to win. These denuded fields are, I think, more of a reflection on both the continuing malaises of the global economy, as well as the growing performance disparity between the factory LMP1 squads and the privateers, as they saw any hopes of outright victory draw further and further away, and with those hopes, so too went sponsorship money. This was, again, borne out at Le Mans. I think that might be the phrase of the video. The fastest Rebellion, now running Toyota 3.4-liter V8 engines that would in some ways inform the Japanese Marque's return to La Sarthe the next year, remained 6 seconds a lap behind the factory diesels, and Level 5 Motorsports brought the only B08-derived LMP2, only to then qualify last out of all the prototypes. There was still one of the Lola Astons kicking around, and while one of the Rebellion cars failed to finish, as did the PCOM Racing Budget Lola, Level 5 Motorsports managed a class podium and 10th overall, and Rebellion was, again, best of the rest in LMP1, behind the sole of the surviving debutante R18s that finished atop the podium ahead of 4 908s, the closest of which was mere seconds behind Red Sonja. To be fair, after a relatively clean race for the car, the Rebellion was 17 laps down, but it was only 1 behind the Orica Matmut Peugeot, and the Lola Aston that finished next best, in 7th overall, was a further 10 laps behind. So, really, the Rebellion did pretty well, and having 3 cars in the top 10, especially with what was essentially a 4-year-old base design at that point, isn't anything to complain about. The Intercontinental Cup did return for a second and final year, but again was comprised almost entirely of pre-existing races, just adding a race in China to round out the season yet again, and thus Peugeot largely ran rampant over the season. Rebellion did contest the full season, however, and after Aston Martin gave up the AMR1 program as a bad job, quite rightly, following their disastrous Le Mans, they brought out their older B09s to finish up the year. But Of course, victory for either team in the championship was out of the question, and Rebellion finished third with only one retirement in the season at Silverstone. Level 5 Motorsports and LMP2 had a few podiums, but as they didn't contest either the Silverstone or the Chinese rounds, they similarly weren't in the mix for the championship. For 2012, fortunately, the Intercontinental Le Mans Cup was reorganized into the World Endurance Championship, and the Le Mans Series was finally rebranded as the ALMS, with the two series now running distinct races from each other, though the WEC and ALMS still shared the 12 Hours of Sebring as a season opener. For the final factory-supported development year of our Lolas, we received the B12/60 and /80. This final design evolution added the newly mandated cutouts at the apex of the wheel arches, which was intended to minimize pressure buildup at high speeds that could cause cars to become airborne. The rear fin was enlarged further, suspension was updated, the front bodywork changed again to refine aerodynamics, and we got a third headlamp in each lighting pod, at least for the Rebellions. I think that aesthetically they finally really got the car right, as up until this point the nose/toe box had been really a bit of a letdown, except for the low-lasting variant of the B09. Be that as it may, in the ALMS, Dyson Racing remained to defend Lola's honor in LMP1, still running a Mazda engine, while Dempsey and Black Swan made attempts at campaigns in LMP2, running a Judd BMW V8 and Honda 2.8-liter turbocharged V6, respectively. Muscle Milk had retired their car, swapping instead to an Acura ARX-03A for LMP1 and moving to Prototype Challenge, which meant an FLM09 Orica, while Level 5 had swapped to an ARX-03B for LMP2, continuing from the end of their previous year's swapping of allegiances to Honda Performance Development, which was an association which bore considerable fruit that year, as both Level 5 and Muscle Milk Picket Racing topped the charts in the ALMS, Level 5 effectively unchallenged with an unbroken string of victories and podiums, as both Lola runners participated but intermittently in LMP2, while Dyson put up a much stronger fight against the Acuras, losing the championship to Muscle Milk by only 5 points, effectively undone by a string of second places to the Acura's firsts in the mid-season, despite outcompeting them at most of the longer races. The new ELMS hardly bears mentioning, however. Only one team entered a Lola in LMP2. There was no more LMP1, that was for the WEC, and that was of Status GP, and they ran only the first 2 races of the season, skipping the double points round at Petit Le Mans to close the season, and finished 6th in the point standings following a podium at Le Castellet and a retirement at Donington. There was more interest in the WEC, however, and Gulf Racing Middle East entered in LMP2 with 2 B12/80s sporting a 4.5-liter Nissan V8 power plant, similar to those powering the Orica and Morgan LMP2s that made up most of the rest of the field, and Lotus got their eye in with Bicolis, running 2 cars powered by a 3.6-liter V8 tuned by Judd. Well, each car had their own engine. They weren't having to share or anything. That would have been complicated. Okay, each pit stop swap engines. It just doesn't work. Anyway, at the sharp end of the field, Rebellion was facing off against a trio of Pescarolos and a duo of ARX-03s for the privateer side, while Toyota had joined with their new TS030 hybrid to compete against Audi, running a modified version of the same V8 that Rebellion had in their B12/60s. There was, this year, a separate trophy for privateers as well, which was nice, in addition to the overall championship and the LMP2 trophy. The LMP2 efforts largely came to naught, with the Bicolis Lotus entries seeing as many retirements as finishes, never better than 6th in class, and Gulf Racing at least managing a podium at Spa before spending the rest of their season as another backmarker. But in LMP1, Rebellion actually had a pretty decent year, in part because they had their own trophy to compete for against the other privateers, but they had a solid performance at Le Mans besides, after not qualifying best of the rest for the first time in a while. That year they were narrowly beat out by Straka's ARX-03. Dyson had planned an entry but withdrew due to financial concerns, and the Middle East Gulf racing car was the first retirement of the 24 Hours that year, following an accident in the Porsche Curves, and other retirements or long stints in the pits for many of the factory cars slowly allowed the number 12 Rebellion to work its way up the order to finish fourth, ahead of the third Audi Yost car and behind the other two and an Audi North America entry, while the number 13 car finished third of the privateer LMP1s and 11th overall. None of the LMP2 Lolas, however, managed to finish. The rest of the season went equally well for Rebellion. Their only non-podium finish in the Privateer Trophy was Sebring, and their string of wins was broken only by a second place at Bahrain, to take the championship from Straka by almost 60 points. I do think that, for the record, the black and gold livery was fantastic, too. There was also a weird side project between Drayson Racing and Lola in 2012, in which they attempted to develop an EV from an LMP1, although to call it an LMP1 at that point is a bit unfair, as in addition to being battery-powered, it had active aero, 850 horsepower, inductive charging, and regenerative damping, which rather belies some of the inherent and expected qualities of an LMP1. At least they painted it green instead of some version of blue, which seems to have somehow become the standard color to tell people that something is electrically powered. Either way, let us speak of it no more. Lola's finances had throughout this period been slowly worsening, and by mid-2012 they were in the midst of bankruptcy proceedings. Unfortunately, unable to find a buyer interested in the storied marque, the company was dissolved in October of that year, raising serious questions about the future of the B08 series as race cars, as the possibility of procuring spares and new components became unsurprisingly uncertain. First to withdraw were the LMP2 squads, again, unsurprising given their generally more limited financial resources, and most of the /80 cars saw only one or two race entries throughout 2013, before largely retiring to serve as garage queens or museum pieces. Rebellion soldiered on for a while, winning the Privateer Trophy yet again in 2013, although with Straka's retirement after Le Mans, there wasn't much competition for them. And for 2014, they had contracted with Orica to build new chassis to replace their B12s. This new chassis was based on the 07 and dubbed the R1, naturally still running on Toyota power, now tuned by AER. Dyson, too, persevered in the ALMS for 2013, largely beaten by Muscle Milk's Acura throughout the season, but they did fare better than the poor old Delta Wing, so something. As a final swan song, the cars actually had a few years of competition in the United Sports Car Championship in the US with Mazda, who partnered with SpeedSource to purchase two B12/80s and re-engine them with a 2.2-liter Skyactiv turbo diesel straight 4. Up against an incredibly robust field of no less than 10 full-season entries in 2014, however, the cars struggled, and the Corvette Gen 3 Daytona prototypes pretty much dominated both 2014 and 15. 2016 saw a few bright-ish spots for the duo, including a podium at Belle Isle behind Action Express and Wayne Taylor Racing, but DPI was inbound for 2017, and Mazda committed to the new formula through a partnership with Riley and Multimatic, retiring their cars at the end of the 2016 season. Obviously, a few have ended up in private hands because I have pictures of them, including the ex-Rebellion car that we've seen a few times in photos for this video, as well as this black and green one, which started out in life racing for Status Grand Prix in 2012 and 13 before being sold on to Mazda, who ran it in 2015 and 2016, though clearly it's been returned to its earlier livery. It last showed up in Sebring Historics in 2022 and was for sale as of last year about this time, now sporting a 5-liter Judd engine, presumably a V8, while the Rebellion car lives over in England land and has also been re-engined with a Judd V8, as the supply of spares for the Toyota engine has apparently also run out. In possibly some good news, the Lola brand and intellectual property rights were purchased in June of 2022 by Till Bechtelsheimer, who intends to resurrect the brand as a competitor in Formula E, partnered with Yamaha and ABT, which is possibly pronounced Abbott, either sometime this or next year, probably next year as we're now in mid-November. Either way, Formula E is a bit of a come-down in my opinion, but we'll see what happens. Okay, for this video's shameless plugs for other content on the channel, we have the following already covered. The Aston Martin DBR1-2, which is also known as the B09/60. We actually avoided mentioning, but I'm going to throw it in the Lavaggi LS1 because it competed contemporaneously with the Lolas with even less success, but arguably more daring do, also mentioned in Underdog Week. Tangentially, the Lola MG EX257, ditto Underdog Week. The Daytona prototypes, kind of mentioned as a shameless plug, more shamelessly than the rest anyway. The Peugeot 908 HDI, the Oreca LM09. Somehow I haven't done a video about the ProDrive Aston Martin DBR1 GT1s yet. Obviously the Lola T70, the Acura ARX03, the Delta Wing, the Corvette Daytona prototype, and I think that about covers it. And finally, before our closing remarks, in response to a couple comments regarding last week's T70 video, which, due to its greater popularity, occasioned rather more comments than usual, yes, I know Denny Hulme's name has an L in it. Just because I'm not massively overpronouncing the L does not mean that some of the particularly tedious among you need to resort to such uselessly pedantic nitpicking in the comments. Get over it. You try and pad one of these out every week and tell me how it goes, you fucking Philistines. The Canada thing was a joke too. If you can't find a sense of humor, go elsewhere. And for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
And because I'm still feeling a little bit testy, in case you couldn't tell, I will merely close with another quote, or at least a paraphrasing, from The Importance of Being Earnest, which is a wonderful comedy, which I highly recommend seeing. A paraphrasing, actually, which feels both appropriate for the quote and for the channel, the latter, hence why I chose it. I don't play for absolute accuracy. Anyone can play accurately. I play for expression, and I keep science for life. And don't forget the cucumber sandwiches. With that, it just leaves me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.